There's a sound that the farmers of western Kansas know the way sailors know the sound of the sea. It's the sound of wind, not a breeze. Kansas doesn't do breezes. Wind. A steady, relentless 25-mile-per-hour current of air that comes off the Colorado plains and crosses the western third of Kansas without hitting a single thing tall enough to slow it down. No mountains, no forests, no hills worth nomming. Just flat open prairie stretching to every horizon, and wind that never stops. In most of America, wind is weather. It comes and goes. You notice it on a stormy day and forget about it the next. In western Kansas, wind is geography. It's as permanent as the soil beneath your feet, or at least as permanent as the soil used to be before the wind started taking that too. This is the story of a man who stopped the wind with rocks that everyone else threw away. Hamilton County sits at the far western edge of Kansas, so far west that the Colorado border is only 30 miles away. The land is flat the way a tabletop is flat, with an elevation around 3,400 feet and an average annual rainfall of 17 inches. Not enough to grow much of anything without help from the Ogallala Aquifer below. In 1962, the county had about 200 active farms, mostly wheat and grain sorghum, mostly irrigated from wells that tapped the aquifer, and mostly struggling with the same problem that had plagued Great Plains farmers since the first plow broke the native sod: wind erosion. Let me explain what wind erosion does to a farm in western Kansas, because the science is the foundation of this story. When wind blows across bare or poorly covered soil, it picks up particles. The smallest particles, clay and silt, go airborne and can travel hundreds of miles. You've seen photographs of dust storms from the 1930s, walls of brown air rolling across the plains like a biblical plague. That was wind erosion on a catastrophic scale, but wind erosion doesn't have to be dramatic to be devastating. On any given windy day in western Kansas, and there were 120 windy days a year in Hamilton County, a farmer could lose a fraction of an inch of topsoil. Not enough to see, not enough to measure with a ruler, but enough that over a decade fields that had started with 12 inches of black topsoil were down to 8, then 6, then 4. 4 inches of topsoil will grow a crop, but it won't grow a good crop, and it won't hold moisture the way 12 inches will. Every inch of topsoil the wind takes is an inch of productivity that doesn't come back. Not in a season, not in a decade, not in a lifetime. It takes nature about 500 years to build 1 inch of topsoil. The wind can remove it in 5. The government knew this. After the Dust Bowl, the federal government had planted 220 million trees across the Great Plains in a massive project called the Shelter Belt. Rows of trees designed to break the wind and protect the soil behind them. The program worked, but by 1962, a lot of those original shelter belts were dying. 30 years old, weakened by drought and disease and neglect. And the new generation of farmers was more interested in pulling trees out to make room for center pivot irrigation than in planting new ones. In Hamilton County, the county extension agent, a man named Roger Voss, told farmers the same thing every year at the annual conservation meeting. Plant shelter belts. Trees are your best defense against wind erosion. And every year the farmers said the same thing back. Roger, trees take 20 years to grow tall enough to matter. I need help now. They weren't wrong. A freshly planted tree row is about as useful as a windbreak as a fence made of string. It takes 15 to 20 years for a shelter belt to reach the height and density needed to significantly reduce wind speed across a field. That's a generation of farming. Most farmers in Hamilton County couldn't afford to wait a generation for their soil to stop blowing. So they did what Kansas farmers do. They farmed anyway, accepted the erosion as a cost of doing business, and hoped that this year's wind wouldn't be worse than last year's. Every farmer in Hamilton County accepted this. Every farmer except Nolan Krider. Nolan was 44 years old in 1962 and had farmed 320 acres on the western edge of the county since 1946, the year he came home from the Navy and married Helen Pankratz, whose father owned the land. 16 years of farming, and every one of those years, the wind had taken a little more of his topsoil. Nolan's farm was in the worst possible position. It sat on the western edge of the county, the first farmland the Colorado wind hit when it crossed the state line. There was nothing to the west but open range and short grass prairie for 80 miles. The wind that reached Nolan's fields had been building speed since the Rocky Mountains, and it hit his topsoil like a river hits a sandbar. His yields showed it. In 1962, Nolan's wheat averaged 21 bushels per acre. The county average was 34. His grain sorghum averaged 42 bushels. The county average was 58. He was farming the same soil and the same climate with the same seed and the same techniques as his neighbors and getting 60% of their yield. The difference was wind exposure. His western fields had no protection. His soil was thinner, drier, and more depleted than farms even a mile to the east. Roger Voss had been telling Nolan to plant a shelter belt since 1955. Nolan had considered it. He'd even priced out seedlings from the Kansas Forest Service. Red cedar, Austrian pine, Rocky Mountain juniper. The cost wasn't bad. About $200 for enough trees to plant a quarter-mile row on his western boundary. But $200 wasn't the real cost. The real cost was time. 20 years of watching saplings grow while his topsoil blew. 20 years of thin yields. 20 years of losing ground, literally, to a problem that got worse every season. "I don't have 20 years," Nolan told Roger in the spring of 1962. "My soil's down to 5 inches on the west quarter. At this rate, I'll be farming subsoil before those trees are tall enough to break the wind." "Then what's your plan?" Roger asked. Nolan pointed to the corner of his field where a pile of rocks sat. Field stones he'd pulled out of the soil during spring tillage. The same stones that every farmer in Hamilton County pulled every spring and dumped in a fence row or a gully or a truck bound for the gravel pit. "Those," Nolan said. Roger looked at the rock pile. Then he looked at Nolan, then back at the rock pile. "You want to build a windbreak out of rocks. I want to build a wall, 4 feet high along my entire western boundary, half a mile." Roger Voss was a patient man. Extension agents in western Kansas had to be, but his patience had limits. "Nolan, a stone wall is not a recognized soil conservation practice. There's no research supporting stone walls as windbreaks in Great Plains agriculture. The Soil Conservation Service recommends tree shelter belts. Grass strips and strip cropping. Nobody builds walls." "Nobody in Kansas," Nolan said, "but they build them in Scotland. They build them in Ireland. They build them in New England, and they've been building them for 1,000 years. The wind blows in those places too. Those are different climates, different soils, different farming systems." "Wind is wind, Roger. A 4-foot wall breaks the wind the same way in Kansas as it does in Scotland. Physics doesn't care about the zip code." Roger shook his head and wrote something in his notebook. He drove away. Nolan started building the next day. "Let me tell you about the rocks, because they're the raw material of this story and they were free." Hamilton County sits on what geologists call the high plains surface, a layer of sediment deposited millions of years ago by rivers flowing east from the Rocky Mountains. Mixed into this sediment are stones of every size and composition. Limestone from ancient seabeds, flint from chalky deposits, granite from glacial drift, sandstone from river channels. The freeze-thaw cycle of Kansas winters pushes these stones to the surface every spring the way bread dough pushes raisins to the top when it rises. Farmers hate field stones. They break plow blades. They jam combine headers. They puncture tires. Every spring before planting, every farmer in Hamilton County walked his fields and picked up rocks. The rocks went to the fence line, to the gully, to the gravel pit. They were waste. They were the thing you removed before you could farm. Nolan Krider was about to turn that waste into the most effective windbreak in Hamilton County. He started in April of 1962 on the southwest corner of his property. His plan was simple: build a dry-stacked stone wall. No mortar, no cement, just stone on stone, 4 feet high and 18 inches wide, running north along his entire western boundary for a half-mile, 2,640 feet. Dry stacking was an ancient technique. You selected your stones for shape and fit, placing larger flat stones on the bottom and smaller ones on top, interlocking them like puzzle pieces so that gravity and friction held the wall together. No machinery required, no special tools. Just hands, a strong back, and an eye for how stones fit together. Nolan had never read a book about dry stacking or taken a class. What he had was 16 years of pulling rocks out of his fields and noticing that some rocks were flat, some were round, some were angular, and they all had surfaces that locked together if you placed them right. He worked alone for the first 2 years. Every morning before field work, he spent 2 hours on the wall. Every evening after field work, another 2 hours. Weekends, he worked all day. He hauled rocks from his own fields, then from his neighbors' fields. They were happy to let him take their waste. "Nolan's coming for rocks again," they'd say at the co-op. "I told him he could have every stone on my place. Saves me hauling them to the pit." What's he building? A wall, a stone wall 4 feet high along his west boundary. What for? He says it'll stop the wind. And then came the laughter. Because in Hamilton County, Kansas in 1962, the idea of stopping the wind with a pile of rocks was about as serious as stopping the rain with an umbrella. The John Deere dealer in Syracuse, a man named Merle Haxton, was the most vocal critic. "Nolan Krider is building a medieval wall," Merle announced at the co-op one Saturday morning, 4 feet high out of rocks to stop the Kansas wind. He paused for effect. "Next thing you know, he'll be digging a moat and raising the drawbridge." The crowd laughed. Merle was good at this. The public performance, the easy mockery, the crowd-pleasing dismissal of anything that didn't involve buying new equipment from his showroom. "Somebody ought to tell Nolan that we have tractors now," Merle continued. "We have center pivots. We have herbicides. We have modern farming. We don't need to go back to the Stone Age to solve our problems." The name stuck. Nolan Krider became the rock man. His wall became the medieval wall. And for 6 years, while Nolan stacked stones one by one along his western boundary, the county laughed. By the end of 1962, Nolan had completed about 400 feet of wall, roughly a sixth of the total distance. The wall was 4 feet high, 18 inches wide at the base, tapering to 12 inches at the top. Each stone was selected by hand, placed by hand, fitted to the stones around it by trial and error. There were no straight lines. The wall followed the natural contour of the fence line. It was, by any objective measure, beautiful work. But beauty wasn't the point. Function was the point. In the spring of 1963, with only 400 feet of wall completed, Nolan got his first indication that the function was working. He noticed it in his wheat. The rows closest to the completed section of wall, within about 60 feet of the structure, were taller than the rows farther away. Not dramatically taller, maybe 2 inches, but 2 inches in early season wheat is significant. It meant more moisture in the root zone, less wind stress on the plants, and better growing conditions in the microclimate created by the wall. 2 inches, 400 feet of wall. If 400 feet of partial wall produced a 2-inch height advantage in the nearest rows, what would a half-mile of complete wall do? Nolan didn't tell anyone. He just kept building. 1963, another 500 feet, 900 total. 1964, 600 feet, 1,500 total. 1965, 500 feet, 2,000 total. By 1965, the wall stretched nearly to the midpoint of his western boundary. The wheat behind the completed section was visibly different from the wheat on the unprotected portion of the field. Taller, thicker, darker green. The difference was obvious from the county road. People noticed. "Have you seen Nolan's west field?" they'd say at the co-op. "The south half looks 10 days ahead of the north half." "It's the wall," someone would reply. "It's not the wall, it's probably a soil difference, or he's irrigating more on that side." "He's not irrigating more," I asked him. But nobody was ready to credit a rock wall with improving crop growth. Not in Kansas, not in 1965. 1966, 400 feet, 2,400 total. 1967, 240 feet, 2,640 feet, done. 6 years, half a mile, approximately 10,000 individual stones, each one selected, hauled, and placed by one man working alone. The wall was finished in October of 1967. The first full growing season behind the complete wall was 1968. Nolan planted wheat on his west quarter, 80 acres that had been his worst performing ground for 16 years. The wheat came up thick. The stand was denser than he'd ever seen on that quarter. The plants were uniform, healthy, and growing fast. By May, the difference between Nolan's west quarter and the unprotected fields to the north was visible from half a mile away. Roger Voss drove to Nolan's farm and walked the field. "What am I looking at?" Roger said, standing at the edge of the wheat. "You're looking at 38 bushels, Nolan said. 38. Your west quarter has never done more than 23. It's never had a wall before." Roger walked to the wall. He stood on the downwind side and held up his hand. The wind that was blowing his hat on the upwind side was barely detectable on the field side. The wall wasn't stopping the wind entirely. Air still moved over the top and around the ends, but it was reducing the velocity by what felt like 70 or 80% for a distance of about 200 feet downwind. "That's a significant reduction," Roger admitted. "It's not just the height," Nolan said, "it's the mass. This wall weighs maybe 150 tons. The wind hits it and the energy has to go somewhere. Some goes over the top, some around the ends, but a lot of it just stops, dissipates. The wall absorbs it." He picked up a stone from the base. "Each one of these is a baffle. The wind enters the wall through the gaps between the stones and loses energy bouncing around inside the structure. By the time it comes out the other side, it's not wind anymore. It's air, and air doesn't blow topsoil." Roger stared at him. "Where did you learn that?" "I didn't learn it. I watched it. I've been watching wind hit this wall for 6 years." The 1968 harvest confirmed what Nolan's eyes had been telling him. The west quarter produced 39 bushels of wheat per acre. The county average that year was 36. Nolan's worst field had become better than average. 1969, 41 bushels. 1970, 44 bushels. 1971, 43 bushels. The yield improvement wasn't just from wind reduction. The wall was creating a cascade of benefits that compounded over time. First, the obvious. Less wind meant less topsoil loss. The soil behind the wall was getting thicker, not thinner. After 10 years, soil measurements showed that the west quarter had gained almost an inch of topsoil while unprotected fields in the county had lost an inch. A 2-inch differential in topsoil depth translates to significant differences in water holding capacity, nutrient availability, and microbial activity. Second, moisture conservation. Wind evaporates moisture from the soil surface. Less wind meant less evaporation, which meant more water available for the crop, especially critical in a county that averaged 17 inches of rainfall. Nolan estimated his wall-protected fields retained 15 to 20% more soil moisture than his unprotected fields in a dry year. That was the difference between a crop and a failure. Third, snow capture. In winter, the wall acted as a snow fence. Drifts accumulated on the downwind side, and when the snow melted in spring, the moisture soaked into the soil. Free irrigation, courtesy of the same wind that used to steal his topsoil. Fourth, and this was the one nobody expected, the wall created habitat. The gaps between the stones became home to beneficial insects, spiders and small snakes that preyed on crop pests. Field mice nested in the wall base, attracting hawks and owls. The wall became a miniature ecosystem, a strip of biodiversity running along the edge of the field. Nolan hadn't planned any of this. He built a wall to stop the wind. The wall stopped the wind and then did four other things he hadn't expected. In the spring of 1970, Merle Haxton drove past Nolan's farm on his way to a service call. He slowed down, then he stopped. The difference was undeniable. On the north side of Nolan's property, beyond the wall's protection, the fields looked like every other field in Hamilton County. Thin wheat, pale soil, wind streaks visible in the stand. On the south side, behind the wall, the wheat was a different shade of green. Darker, thicker. The soil between the rows was darker too. Even from the road, you could see the line where the wall's influence ended and normal conditions resumed. Merle sat in his truck for a long time. Then he drove to Nolan's farm. Nolan was in his barn sharpening a cultivator shovel on the grinder. He looked up when Merle walked in. Merle. Nolan. They hadn't spoken in years. That wall, Merle said, it's working. Has been for 3 years. Your wheat looks different from everyone else's. It is different, it's got topsoil under it. Nobody else's does anymore. Merle was quiet for a moment, then he looked at his boots. I called it medieval. You did. I said you were going back to the Stone Age. You said that too. The wall works. 39 bushels on ground that used to give me 21. You tell me if it works. Merle looked at Nolan. How much would it cost to build one on my brother's place? He's losing ground on his west quarter too. Nolan set down the cultivator shovel. How many rocks has your brother got on his place? Plenty. He pulls them every spring like everybody does. Then it costs nothing but time. Rocks are free. Labor is his own. 6 years of work, that's the price. Merle didn't say anything else. He drove away. But the next spring, a stone wall started going up on Merle's brother's farm, 3 miles north of Nolan's. And the spring after that, another wall on a farm east of Syracuse. By 1975, there were 7 stone walls in Hamilton County. Nolan hadn't built any of them. The other farmers had built their own, using Nolan's wall as a template. They came to his farm, walked the wall, studied the construction, and went home to do the same thing on their own boundaries. Roger Voss, the county agent who had once told Nolan that stone walls weren't a recognized practice, published a bulletin in 1973 titled Stone Windbreaks in Western Kansas, an alternative to traditional shelter belts. The bulletin included yield data from Nolan's farm, soil moisture measurements, and a construction guide based on Nolan's methods. It was the first official recognition that a farmer with no engineering degree had developed a soil conservation technique that outperformed the standard recommendation. The Soil Conservation Service sent a field officer to Hamilton County in 1974. He spent 3 days measuring wind speed, soil movement, and crop performance on both sides of Nolan's wall. His report confirmed what Nolan had known for 12 years. The wall reduced wind speed by 60 to 75% for a distance of up to 200 feet downwind. Soil loss behind the wall was essentially zero, compared to an average of 2 tons per acre per year on unprotected fields in the county. 2 tons per acre per year on 320 acres. That's 640 tons of topsoil that Nolan's wall saved every single year. Over 30 years, almost 20,000 tons of soil that stayed on Nolan's farm while his neighbor's soil blew to Oklahoma. The SCS officer asked Nolan how he'd known the wall would work. I didn't know, Nolan said. I guessed, but it was an educated guess. I'd watched the wind hit every vertical surface on my farm for 16 years. The barn, the grain bin, the equipment shed. Every one of them had a calm zone on the downwind side where the dust didn't blow and the snow piled up. A wall is just a longer, lower version of a building. Same physics, but you built it from materials nobody considered useful. The rocks aren't useful to a farmer who's trying to plow. They're useful to a farmer who's trying to stop wind. Different problem, different definition of useful. The officer included that quote in his report. It was cited in 3 subsequent SCS publications. Nolan farmed until 1992. He was 74. He had built one wall and inspired 19 more across Hamilton County. He'd watched his worst field become his best field. He'd turned 10,000 rocks, the waste product of Kansas farming, into the most effective windbreak in the county. His son Paul took over the farm and the wall. The wall needed almost no maintenance. Dry-stacked stone walls are self-correcting. When a stone shifts, the ones above it settle into the gap. When frost heaves a section, the weight of the stones above pushes it back. The wall Nolan built from 1962 to 1967 is still standing today. Over 60 years later, every stone in place, still breaking the wind, still saving the soil. In 2004, Paul's daughter Sarah wrote a paper at Kansas State University about her grandfather's wall. Her advisor, a professor of agronomy who had spent his career studying soil conservation, read the paper and made one change. He crossed out the word vernacular in the title and wrote brilliant. Nolan Krider died in 2007 at the age of 89. His funeral was at the Mennonite Church in Syracuse. A small service, quiet the way Nolan had been quiet all his life. Roger Voss came. Merle Haxton's brother came. The SCS field officer, now retired, drove from Wichita. Paul spoke at the service. He said one thing about his father that captured everything. My father looked at rocks and saw a wall. Everyone else looked at the same rocks and saw trash. That's the difference between a man who solves problems and a man who complains about them. The rocks were always there. The wind was always there. My father just put one in front of the other. The wall is still standing. Paul's daughter Sarah maintains it now. The 3rd generation. The wheat behind it still outperforms the county average. The topsoil is still dark, still deep, still holding moisture in a county where most fields have lost half their original soil depth. And every spring when the freeze-thaw cycle pushes new rocks to the surface of the fields around the wall, Sarah picks them up the same way her grandfather did, the same way her father did, and adds them to the wall. Not because the wall needs them, because the wall taught her family that nothing the land gives you is waste, not if you know what to do with it. Nolan Krider built a wall not because he was told to, not because anyone believed in it, not because there was a program or a subsidy or a manual that said it would work. He built it because his soil was blowing away, and he had 10,000 rocks and nothing but time. The soil stopped blowing, the yields doubled, the wall still stands. And the rocks, the ones everyone threw away, the ones nobody wanted, the ones that broke plow blades and jammed combines and made every farmer in the county curse every spring, those rocks turned out to be the most valuable thing on the farm.